Good evening and welcome to the Linbury Theatre here at the Royal Opera House, Covent Garden, for another of our insights supported by Rolex. I'm Petrock Trelawney, and a warm welcome to our audience here in London and to our audience joining us around the world in our live stream. In tonight's insight, we're going to explore Leonard Bernstein's double bill of operas, Trouble in Tahiti and A Quiet Place, a new production of which, directed by Oliver Mears, opened on this stage on October the 10th. The season runs through until October the 24th. Leonard Bernstein, you don't need me to say this, was a hugely important 20th century cultural figure, a towering presence in the world of classical music, and yet so much more. A great and gifted conductor, he was a fine musical educator whose television masterclasses introduced generations of young people to classical music. He was a composer equally at home in the concert hall and on Broadway, with shows including On the Town in 1944 and West Side Story in 1957. Well, in an intimate new production for the Linbury Theatre, the theatre presents two contrasting yet connected visions of America. American suburbia in the 1950s, and then the sense of disillusionment that crept in the 1980s. Bernstein's double portrait of American domestic life and one family's struggle to connect and heal over a 30-year period. With catchy tunes and show-stopping numbers, the music for Trouble in Tahiti very much references Leonard Bernstein, the man of Broadway. With his score to A Quiet Place, he leads us into a new world, a radical, daring departure for the composer. We have a brilliant cast this evening to discuss Trouble in Tahiti and A Quiet Place. Nicholas Chalmers, making his debut at the Royal Opera, conducting both shows. Stars Henry Neale, Wallace Junter, Grant Doyle and Rowan Pearce. And later on we'll be joined by three writers, broadcasters and academics to talk about the show and Leonard Bernstein and how the two works fit into his rich life. Nigel Simeone, Edward Seckerson and Sophie Redfern. Let's start by meeting the creative triumvirate behind the resurrection of these two operas. Director Oliver Mears, movement director Sarah Fay, and conductor Nicholas Chalmers. Please welcome them to the Linbury Theatre stage. Ollie, let's start with you. When did you decide you wanted to put these operas on, and why?
Good question. These operas and this particular production has been a very long time in the gestation, actually dating back to when I was in Northern Ireland and I was the artistic director there. And Nick and I had collaborated on a production of Trouble in Tahiti, so I already knew about A Quiet Place. And I had a listen, and I knew that the orchestral forces were absolutely enormous, about 80 players and electric guitars and synths. And I knew that it wouldn't be practical to do in Northern Ireland. And then I heard about this new chamber reduction by Garth Sunderland, which is an incredibly effective distillation of the orchestral sound, but also makes some very strategic and clever cuts to the material, making it much more digestible and more theatrical as well. And as soon as I heard this new version, I thought, we've got to do this. I think it would go down really well. It'd be very accessible in Northern Ireland. And then I left and I got this job. We were going to do it in May 2020, and you probably remember what happened then. So we had to postpone it. So on and off, we've been talking about doing this for nearly 10 years.
Because I think the posters were up, weren't they? I remember seeing the show advertised, and then it went. So it was particularly joyous to see them back outside.
Yeah, and both pieces have been a real labour of love. So even though we've had to wait 4 years after the initial postponement, I think it's been worth the wait from our point of view anyway. I can speak for the audience.
Nick, musically, these really are two incredibly contrasting works, aren't they?
Yes, 3 decades apart, Trouble in Tahiti from 1951 and then A Quiet Place written in 1983. Completely different worlds musically really, but A Quiet Place does quote elements of Trouble in Tahiti, especially when there's sort of a lot more angst in the family. In Act 3 you hear quotes from the family breakfast table which came in Trouble in Tahiti. So there are elements which he uses in both operas, but it's just a completely different sound world, and I think by the time Bernstein got to 1983, he was 2 years after the death of his wife. He wanted to write this piece, but also I think there was an element of himself who wasn't, I think, probably taken as seriously as he wanted to be as a composer. So I think he wanted to write this piece which showed him reflecting the wide body of 20th century music. It mixes tonality and atonality, very diverse instrumentations. We're so lucky to have the Orchestra of the Royal Opera House playing this reduction by Garth. It sounds so fabulous in here. And if you can see to the sides here and the audience at home, you've got the percussion all around us and surrounding us. So it really is a theatre filler.
And it seems to me, I mean, I've seen Trouble in Tahiti, I think, half a dozen times, but like most people, I've never had the chance to see A Quiet Place. It seems to me, listening to Garth's reduction, that it's almost inconceivable it could be for a full-size opera orchestra because it works so well in this small scale.
Absolutely. It's conceived originally for 74 players, and Ollie's talked about the instrumentation, and now it's reduced to acoustic instruments only. And it's very effectively done. Single strings, very effective use of woodwind, especially clarinets. You've got bass clarinet, clarinet in E flat, clarinet in B flat, clarinet in A. And there's so many instruments for one player in the pit, you know, contrabassoon and bassoon, oboe and cor anglais. So it's very effective, and it's now reduced to 21 players in this, and then 18 players for Trouble in Tahiti.
Sarah, Trouble in Tahiti, let's start with that in terms of the movement, does have these very definite elements of Broadway about it, and the movement that you've created feels very much of that early 1950s Broadway world.
Yes, I didn't actually really think about that in the creation of the movement material. The thing that I'm always really interested in is psychology and how that then provokes behaviour that then in the theatre you can repeat. And I work very much as a kind of facilitator within the director's vision of what a world is and what a character is. So the music itself and the punctuation, if you think of a normal sentence, you have syntax, you have punctuation, and it's the same in music. You have punctuation, and it's the rests or the kind of breaths between ideas that help you understand things. It's the same in movement and behavior. So when we move or when we do something, we read it from the outside in relation to where something begins and where something ends and how it provokes then the next thought. So we would always talk about the psychology motivating behaviour that then I would help as a movement director facilitate with the performer. So
and the movement, it strikes me as very fascinating, particularly at the beginning of A Quiet Place, which is set in a funeral parlour waiting for the funeral to take place. The sort of body language between the characters says absolutely everything about them before we hear the words of the libretto.
Yeah, it's true. And again, it's all actually about psychology, and it's about having those conversations with each of the performers, and that would be through Ollie, but then I would then work in a kind of more intimate way sometimes to really then work out how that's made manifest through the body and how you can repeat it and how that marries up with what Nick's trying to do as well.
One of the particular challenges of that scene, of the funeral scene, is there are so many different conversations going on at once, and how you make sure that the audience are looking at the right place and the right time and the right people who are talking, which entails various things, but it certainly implies a level of detail in what people who aren't singing are doing, which should be as low focus as possible in their physicality. Yeah.
And of course, in the middle of the stage is a coffin, which quite often draws the eye.
Yeah, no, I think that's true. It's a very important character in the production.
So one decision you had to take early on, and we should perhaps talk at this point a little bit about the production history of the piece. Trouble in Tahiti, done in the early 1950s. Then A Quiet Place is staged for the first time in Houston, I think, and wasn't an unqualified success, I think it's fair to say. So then the decision was taken to, rather than have it as a separate one-act opera, to cut up Trouble in Tahiti and run it as a couple of flashback scenes within the body of A Quiet Place. Yeah. And for many years, that's how it was always staged. But you decided you wanted to go back to Bernstein's original concept of two separate one-act shows.
I mean, actually, that decision was partly driven by the fact that Garth's new version of A Quiet Place did excise Trouble in Tahiti. Initially, there was a conversation about the estate being quite keen for A Quiet Place to exist on its own terms, but I was very keen to do Trouble in Tahiti because it plays such an important part in contextualising the people who meet in A Quiet Place. Otherwise, you're wondering, well, who was this person, Diana, and why was she so significant to them? So I think also this idea of making it an American epic was central to our concept for the whole evening, and doing it consecutively seemed important. I mean, I also think that you're right to say that the first time A Quiet Place was done, it was really given a critical mauling, and I think that Bernstein lost a lot of confidence in himself and in the piece, and was open to ideas that I don't think have served the piece. I don't think doing it as a flashback is a very good theatrical idea. And after that, after it was done in 1986, I think it was, in Vienna, it really didn't see the light of day for a long time. And I think it needed powerful advocacy from people like Christopher Alden, who did do that version in New York, but then this new version by Garth Sunderland, I think, really makes a very strong case for it.
Nicholas, let's talk about the musical structure of both pieces, starting with Trouble in Tahiti, which has this chorus who are above us at the beginning of the show, who play a vital role, don't they? And they might be there, or they might be on the radio.
Exactly. Well, in our production, they sort of emerge, and as the score suggests, Dinah turns on the radio, and they sort of appear mystically sort of above us at the top of the stage.
And they sound a little, there's a little bit of static, isn't there?
Oh yeah, we have a very clever sort of sound team here, and we give them that sort of slight sort of radio quality, that really sort of, you imagine sort of three singers around a 1950s radio mic. It's exactly the kind of sound we're going for. And then we sort of warm up the sound within the space, this beautiful acoustic in here. And it's a very special sound sung by these three great British singers. It's for a baritone, a tenor, and for a soprano. And it's just very closely scored, very close harmony, accompanied by kit and instruments within the orchestra, sort of mainly woodwind and a bit of brass punctuation. And it just gives you that really brilliant 1950s radio feel. It's really swingy. And it really sets the scene. It sets this sort of idyllic scene in a way, but that's soon washed away by the sort of the content of the opera.
It's idyllic yet dark, isn't it? As we're told about these different sort of examples of the suburban American dream, where we're set in one of them, but other places are referenced as well. There's something dark about it.
There is something quite dark about it, and there's quite a lot of chromaticism in the harmony. You get a taste of it, and then as soon as the scene opens with Sam and Dinah together, you get this very percussive rhythms, which is quite angry music straight away. You get straight into this sort of dysfunctional couple on stage. It's so cleverly scored there, and it's so beautifully through composed. In preparing this opera, I'll confess to everybody, it's probably the hardest thing I've ever had to do. I've conducted Thomas Adder's Powder Her Face, all sorts of contemporary choral scores. This has taken basically since 2020 to learn, and we've been so lucky with our cast. But Trouble in Tahiti is a bit like a sort of Mozart opera in terms it's got to sound so perfect. It's got all these very sort of snappy chords and intricate moments, and A Quiet Place is more sort of dystopian and wild, and you can let the music go a bit. It's sort of Bernstein really letting his hair down a bit in terms of everything. So approaching the learning of both operas and working with our cast, I've had to sort of really treat Trouble in Tahiti in this very sort of clinical musical way to make it sort of a polished gem.
There are several moments in Trouble in Tahiti, arias, I think we could call them, that are really absolutely kind of classic Bernstein moments, aren't they? I mean, you're reminded of something like Glitter and Piguet from Candide.
Absolutely. And we all hear this evening Wallace Junta singing What a Movie. She goes to the cinema to see Trouble in Tahiti, and she comes back and reflects on it, and the music really kicks off. We have all the kit playing, high woodwind, lots of great choreography from Sarah and everybody, and great singing, and it has to really cut through in this theatre. And then Henry Neal in the gym as Sam in There's a Law, very muscular aria.
Well, I want to talk to Sarah about the staging of that scene, because it's quite a sort of revelatory scene. Sam's gone off to the office, presumably in Manhattan, as he does every day on the train, and he goes off to the gym, and it's this kind of extraordinary song about masculinity, isn't it, that you've staged in a very interesting way.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of that is down to Ollie, but the idea of kind of being a winner, and that being about kind of being physically alpha and strong, and
Sam doesn't have much on during this.
He doesn't have much on, but it's kind of hyper masculinity that then is really, you see a glimmer right at the end of the aria of him suddenly doubting his own alpha-ness, and then when you meet him 30 years on in A Quiet Place, you realize that the idea of winning all the time and the idea of kind of knowing everything and being stronger than everybody else actually has not served him well. And I mean, that's a problem with the American dream, isn't it? Is you only have, you can only win, you can only be successful, and that all the mess of being a human being, or all the kind of stuff that doesn't fit into that idea, doesn't have anywhere to go, which is why you have the worm and the apple that creates, the world of Trouble in Tahiti. And then
The word A Quiet Place, or the reference to A Quiet Place and what it might represent, is used several times in Trouble in Tahiti. We then get there in the second opera, which starts with this extraordinary scene we've mentioned in the funeral parlour, but then it's almost as if the camera sort of zooms in onto much more intimate moments in bedrooms, for example. I mean, it becomes very intense.
Well, it does become intense, and again, I think it's a very skillful rendering of the original, whereby you open with this quite extraordinary and witty and unusual scene in the funeral parlour. I don't know in many other, in fact, I don't know any other scenes that are set as funeral, and it's very effective. And then, yes, you do zoom in, and you effectively have these four characters and their relationships for the rest of the opera. And again, that's a very good work of excision by Garth, because in some versions you had the chorus coming back in the last act, and you even had different characters from the funeral parlour come back in their initial version. And the fact that it does suddenly zoom in makes it very, very effective theatre, and unlike anything else in opera, actually. And again, we've been very lucky to have a really fabulous ensemble cast, and those four principal characters are played with such skill and truth and virtuosity. It's been a great pleasure to watch them.
Last question to Nick. We have in A Quiet Place a very different sound world, and I think it's fair to say for the audience a harder sound world, one that we have to work a little bit more at. It's not quite as straightforwardly painted as perhaps Trouble in Tahiti is.
I think the great skill we've had to sort of acquire in doing this is the nuance, is find all the nuance in the music. There's so many different sort of themes and energetic rhythmic sections. It's so Bernstein in many respects. It's so intimate as well. We've got to pivot all the time in the orchestra. I mean, it's a solid hour and 40 of playing with so many different scenes and variety in it. It just requires a complete change in emotion for all of us at all moments. It's an absolutely exhausting but thrilling thing. I love every single night, but I do mop quite a lot of sweat off my brow by the end of it, I can tell you that.
Well, look, it's really exciting seeing the two of you working together again as well after Belfast and Second Movement, the company that you were joint artistic directors of. So let's hope there's more to come there. Thank you all very much indeed for joining us. Wally, I know you're going to return later on for our final conversation, but let's give a round of applause and thank Nick and Sarah. Let's have a taste of the music of Trouble in Tahiti now. We're going to meet the character Dinah, played by Wallace Junta. Patrick Milne is at the piano. Please welcome Patrick and Wallace to the Linbury Theatre stage.
It would bore I must say he's really a man, 6 feet tall, and each foot just incredible. Rather madly in love, but there's trouble ahead. There's a legend. If a princess marry white man and reign for the day, then the white man shall be sacrificed without delay. Sure enough, on the night of the wedding day, there's a storm like nothing on earth. Tidal waves and chicagoes and hurricanes, and to top it all off, the volcano erupts as the natives sing. Alright, they go crazy with the drumming and the chanting ritual dance. While always sing a ballad of self-ceremony. Oh, it's so lovely, I wish I could think of it. Da-da-dee-da-da-da-da. It was called Iron Magic, I think it was. Oh, a beautiful song, I remember it now. Island magic, where the midnight breezes caress us and the stars above seem to bless us. That's island magic. Island magic. Well, in any case, the hero is tied to a tree. Did I tell you he's a flyer who got lost at sea? Anyway, all the natives are crazy now, running wild with lances and knives, and they pile up the wood for the sacrifice. And the witch doctor comes and he sets it on fire as the natives sing. Alright, well at this point comes the good old US Navy, a-singing a song. They come swarming down in parachutes 1,000 strong. Everything now is cleared up and wonderful. Everyone is happy as God, and they all do a great rumba version of Island Magic, of course. It's a dazzling sight with the sleek-brown native women dancing with those US Navy boys. And a 100-piece symphony orchestra. Island magic, where the palm trees whisper together, and it's always midsummer weather. That's island magic. Island magic, with the one I love very near. Island magic, whispering native words in my ear. Island magic, only you, my darling, could weave it, and I never ever will leave it. And I simply cannot believe it really is mine. Island magic. What a terrible, awful movie. How long have I been standing here chattering? If I don't get going this minute, there won't be any dinner when Sam comes home.
Wallace and Patrick, thank you both very much. Wallace, come over here because we're going to bring on 3 other members of the cast now to chat. Welcome, please, Henry Neal, Grant Doyle, and Rowan Pierce. Yes.
Oh, we need another one. Thank you.
Take your seats. Bravo, Wallace. You Trouble in Tahiti, you did at Opera North, I think. Yeah.
Yes, 2017.
Yeah. So to return to it is exciting.
It is, and this is a very different production, much to my delight. It's so lovely to revisit a role in a totally different way. That's what we like as artists, right?
Yeah.
And Henry, this and Wallace too, it's your Royal Opera House debut.
That's right.
Yes.
How does that feel? Is that an exciting moment?
That's extremely exciting, yeah.
Long
Yeah.
awaited.
Long awaited,
Since
exactly.
2020.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's great it's happening. Let's go through the four of you and tell us a bit about your characters, starting with you, Henry.
So I play Sam in Trouble in Tahiti and Junior in A Quiet Place. And the two are extremely different characters. Sam is a buttoned-up 1950s businessman, square-jawed, broad-shouldered. And he very much has a certain view on life. And his son, Junior, is basically as far away as you could possibly imagine for that. He doesn't fit into any of Sam's ideas of what a man should be in any way. And when they finally come together at the beginning of A Quiet Place, you see that sort of collision of two worlds, which is an extraordinary moment.
And that moment at the beginning, Grant, with you as Sam, the father, in A Quiet Place 30 years after the first opera, I mean, extraordinary at the beginning of the funeral scene, where you seem to spend what feels like a lifetime looking away from your family.
It certainly feels like a lifetime to me, yes. It's about 25 minutes or something like that, yes, where I stand over in that corner and stare at the wall.
Just on the coffin.
Consumed by guilt for what has happened. And then once the guests all leave, I then rip shreds off my kids, who I haven't seen for perhaps 8 years or so, since Dinah has been married, with this amazing aria, You're Late, which as a piece in its own, it's incredibly challenging and very rhythmically sophisticated and unpredictable, much like Sam's character. There are a lot of dynamic changes as well, from fortissimo to pianissimo within the same aria. The things that he utters, he shouts, he screams, and then he mutters under his breath a kind of internal angst and anguish that's going through his mind. And
yet not all is lost, because there are moments of he wants to be tender, he wants to reach out, he wants to... We do see, Bernstein lets us see behind the shouting, to see the internal... It's actually written in the score that when Sam shouts at his children, there's little arrows to say eyes open, and then arrows down to say eyes closed, which is when he utters something internal. And we kind of do that to a certain extent, but we also... I'm conscious that you can't close your eyes, because then you won't be able to see the conductor, and then you're likely to get out of time in that aria, because it is relentless. There are time signature changes every bar, and you can't lose contact with your maestro. Rowan, you are Junior's brother and sort of caught in this triangle.
Yes, so I'm sister to Junior and daughter to Dinah and Sam.
Yes, sister, sorry, not brother, sister.
No problem. And my husband has had a relationship with my brother, so it's quite an interesting triangle of people. But Dee Dee brings a sort of light kindness, and she sort of brings the softer side out of Sam, and she helps Junior when he's going through these psychosis and has difficulties with his mental health. And in the end, she sort of encourages Francois, without really knowing it, that she's the one for him and she's going to be the better choice of a partner. So that's lucky for her in Act 2 that he comes to that realisation.
Yeah. How much younger are you than Junior? I mean, is that spelt out?
Yes, 8 years.
8 years.
Yeah.
So it's very interesting. And you've been there, one senses, for him during the troubles of his life.
Yes, and in fact moved to Canada and have a relationship with Francois to support him and look after him as a sort of mother figure, I guess.
And A Quiet Place, Wallace, ends with your end.
Trouble in Tahiti.
The car crash at the beginning.
Well, it's sort of the bridge between the two, and I suppose depending on how you stage it, whether it's 2 acts or one inside the other, it could be a very different experience. But yeah, I suppose die right at the beginning of the action, and I spend Act 1 at the funeral, my own funeral.
Yeah, and it's incredibly powerful the way your death is sort of it's done, isn't it? I mean, we're very aware of what it is through a few words that you've died in a car crash.
Yes, I actually don't hear very much of it from within the coffin, but it gets opened for this beautiful aria that Grant was talking about. So I find it incredibly moving, I have to say, although I am not moving. I'm doing my very best not to move, but I find that difficult to be a part of every night because it's such a challenging moment to witness a person going through, especially thinking of you as probably reacting to what's happened in our relationship. Anyway.
Is this your first time in a coffin on stage?
Yes, definitely.
Debut. Well, maybe it'll set a new trend.
Oh gosh, I hope not.
Let's talk, Henry, more about the character of Junior, because he's sort of outrageous, isn't he? I mean, he comes on stage kind of dressed as kind of a bit. There's a sort of almost look kind of a nod to the village people, maybe.
Yeah, absolutely. He's certainly an eccentric character. He has bursts of eccentricity and kind of outbursts that are of really quite inappropriate behaviour. Obviously, he turns up to this funeral to shock people with this silly costume on. And he's wearing very short shorts, and that's kind of part of his look. And but he's a deeply, deeply troubled person. You know, we hear about, well, we have nods to, we see him in trouble in Tahiti as a boy, being neglected by his parents who are too busy fighting with each other. And he's grown up into this deeply troubled man. And when he returns, he's nearly 40, and he's developed quite severe, probably undiagnosed mental issues. We assume, therefore, that he's kind of self-diagnosing with drugs. Perhaps when he comes back to this funeral, he's still high. He's a difficult character.
And he does this thing where he rhymes. That's sort of how he kind of deals with
exactly.
Things by coming up with this often very silly but often rather touching rhyme.
Exactly right, yeah. And he actually explains to his father right at the end of A Quiet Place. He manages to explain to his father, when he rhymes, it helps the pain dissipate. And it's such a moving moment. And we kind of understand why he's been stuttering and why he's been rhyming. It's because he's under this horrible mental torment. So it's a very moving moment.
Grant, I guess it's not unique that an opera uses a letter to create a particular moment in the plot, but this is absolutely key, isn't it, to a Quiet Place, reading a letter.
Yes, and you have to make sure that you know where the letter is at all times. And in fact, there was one performance when the letter decided to escape from the pocket of my dressing gown, which I absolutely, my heart froze at that moment.
How very Carabino of you.
Because I went for the letter. It's very hard to do a letter reading scene without a letter.
Yes.
I don't know what happened, but suffice to say, my heart froze, and then I thought, right, what am I going to do? And I turned around and I looked, and there it was sitting on the bed. So I turned that into the drama that, what did I do with the letter? Which obviously, I wasn't acting then. What did I do with that letter?
Is there a letter anywhere?
Yeah. And then, oh, there it is. But yeah, it's actually, it's a really lovely, because you don't have to sing during that moment, you can really give an internal monologue. So you talk through in your mind about what the character is thinking as it's going on. So you look at the letter and you say, what's this letter going to say? It's from Dinah. She didn't mention anything about a letter. We don't know anything. And all of those things going through my mind. And then he decides he's going to read it on kind of impulsively, because he's too scared to know what the truth is. But then impulsively he does read it at the end of Act 2. And we, as the audience, don't get to know what the letter says until quite a bit later. But we do get the impression that it revealed something important and quite devastating for their relationship. I don't know if I'm allowed to spoil it or not.
No, I think you shouldn't.
No,
that would be a spoiler. Wallace, it always fascinates me that he wrote Trouble in Tahiti while on honeymoon, or at least started writing it on honeymoon. And it seems a slightly odd, dysfunctional relationship to be dreaming of on your honeymoon.
I suppose it's interesting. Well, we've established that these characters are based off of his own parents. And I imagine with with what he knew of himself, or was maybe discovering at the time, as far as his sexuality and the pressures in society that he had to face no matter what he wanted, he would have probably been looking at this future that he'd just signed up for as a married heterosexual man, and maybe not with total optimism, and the only example that he would have known being his parents, who by all accounts were incredibly dysfunctional. There was abuse, there was a lot of pain in that family. So it doesn't surprise me that if asked or if inspired to write an opera about a married couple, that's what he came up with. The timing is rather interesting. But I mean, this is a marriage that we now know from this wonderful film that's just come out. Had its ups and downs. It wasn't entirely a failure, but it had to go with the flow and adapt as he did in his life.
Rowan, it feels to me that there is something incredibly universal about a lot of the emotions expressed in a quiet place, and just this idea that people do behave so strangely after a member of a family has died. People do behave so oddly within the community of the family at a funeral, and then afterwards, maybe it's a moment for people to come together. Maybe it's not. It feels very realistic.
Yeah, I think that's one of the most recognisable things about Leonard Bernstein's writing, is that he is so honest and open-hearted, using his own experience through the music. And just as he was on his honeymoon when he wrote Trouble in Tahiti, his wife had just died, and then he wrote A Quiet Place, and this wonderful aria that Sam sings about I miss you, this sort of broken-heartedness of the whole opera. You can really see him, and we have such a sort of responsibility to show that to the audience as well, and it's a challenge probably for all of you to hear that from us, because by the end of the evening we're all tired by this very human experience, and I think that's why you do art, so I'm glad to be part of it in that regard.
You had a very special guest on Saturday night, Jamie Bernstein, Leonard Bernstein's daughter, and I know you got a chance to have a drink with her after the show. I mean, I just wondered, and any of you might want to answer this, but whether there was something that was said or a conversation that was had, or what perhaps she had to say about the piece now, because it's a piece she's intensely proud of, and I know very, very excited that it's come back to the stage here at the Royal Opera.
Well, I heard her say that she'd never seen A Quiet Place even close to this good, and that she couldn't have imagined it more authentically and expertly done. So kudos to
Well, that's
all
great
of
for
you.
the potent.
Yes.
We believe her, of course.
I mean, I'm not in it, so I didn't really have anything to do with that. But I think she was very proud of you all.
Well, it's great that you said that, because then they can
Couldn't possibly comment.
take credit. You must be shattered by the end of it, aren't you? I mean, it's such an intense hour and 40-minute performance.
Yes, I seem to feel like I can hold the emotion back. You can't get too wound up in it. But Henry's final aria wrecks me, really. I think the father. We explore many relationships within this piece, and again, like Rowan said, this opera is able to. We're able to identify with it, because these are emotions and these are things that happen to all of us. We all have to confront death, and we all have relationships with our children and our parents. And Sam's relationship with his son, which is fraught through its whole history, he is unable to accept Junior's homosexuality or indeed his mental illness. Sam is arrogant and entitled, and he sees that as a sign of weakness, and I'm not proud of you, and that's really tough. But in the end, when his final aria, I mean, that just wrecks me. I'm a father of a boy myself, and I don't have that relationship with my son, I'm happy to say, but I can imagine that if I had pushed my son away and my son ended up in a relationship like Sam and Junior, it just absolutely wrecks me, breaks my heart.
Well, we're gonna hear Henry now singing as Junior. So we'll thank Grant, Rowan and Wallace. Thank you very much indeed. And we'll let Henry make his way to the stage. Thank you all.
Thank you.
And welcome back to join Henry, Patrick Milne.
You see, Daddy, that death does bring some relief. Like Didi says, it's like the good Lord never put a finger wrong. I mean, look at my Francois, at my Didi. Look at them and look at me. Like Mommy says, we're only who we are. I was their asses, they were mine, see. And maybe now I find something to find. Maybe a home, or maybe here. Maybe if you, which is. Daddy, did you come to tuck me in? Can I have a glass of water? Sorry, may I have a glass of... Stay some more and sing me the movie song. Ole, the way you do. Before the day I go Canada, Daddy, give me your hand, okay, ole, I'm sorry I'm rhyming, I have this pain, rhyming makes it hurt not so much, it hurts so much to mean so much to you. Merry Christmas, Daddy. Oh, and here's your present. I think you lost it to me. I hope you like it me and wonder where it went. I took it, I think. I know I took it me once. I think. I look, I give it me back to you. I hope you liking it me. I tried as fast as I could. I always thinking you be better off without me. But leave the door open all the way a little, so I can still see the light. Okay.
Henry Neal singing from A Quiet Place by Leonard Bernstein. Thank you to Henry, and thank you, Patrick Milne, playing the piano. Well, we have a great quartet of guests now to talk about where this opera fits, or these operas fit in Leonard Bernstein's life and times. Oliver Mears returns, directing the production and director of opera at the Royal Opera. We have the writers and broadcasters Nigel Simeone and Edward Segerson, and the academic Sophie Redfern. Welcome them all, please, to the Linbury Theatre stage. I thought it might be fun to start by asking each one of you what your first encounter with Leonard Bernstein was, which might have been a recording, or might have been a meeting, or might have been a concert, or whatever. Let's start with you, Nigel, your first Bernstein moment.
I think it was just after I turned 9, and West Side Story was on the telly for the first time. And I think it was Christmas Eve. Absolutely blown away by it, and by the most wonderful stroke of, I don't know, chance, my mum had bought the songbook and put it in my stocking. So I spent the whole of that Christmas holiday picking out the tunes from West Side Story, completely fell in love with it. And then about a decade later, my first trip to New York was when Jerome Robbins did his only revival of West Side Story, the only one he supervised, which was absolutely sensational. So it was West Side Story all the way to begin with, and then obviously other things came along. But
what about you, Sophie?
Well, it's another West Side Story. It's hard for it to be that, really. Original Broadway cast recording. Completely fell in love. It knocked Annie off the top spot of my list of favourite musicals.
Sun stopped coming out tomorrow.
I know. I'm sorry to Annie, and that was it, really. And then I got into Under the Town. So it was with the shows first and foremost for me,
Yeah. Ed?
Well, I'm going to be different. You couldn't make this up, and I haven't. But 1972, the recording of his theatre piece Mass came out. And I became completely obsessed with this piece, and I still think it's a masterpiece and possibly his most important work. And I wrote him a fan letter, care of the Usher Hall, where he was performing Mahler 2. And I thought nothing more about it. I was in Edinburgh going to the performance, and called home, and my mother said that she'd had Harry Kraut, Leonard Bernstein's manager, on the phone. Somehow they tracked down my mother. And Mr. Bernstein was very moved by my letter and invited me to Ely Cathedral, where they were filming the Mahler 2. So those of you that have seen Maestro, I was there.
For the real
but
one.
I didn't actually meet him until 17 years later, when I was writing a cover feature, and finally I got to meet him and spent the most extraordinary hour with the man, talking only about his music. I made that decision that I wouldn't talk about him as a conductor at all, and that was the magic solution, I think, to getting a good interview from him.
We'll come back to that. Ollie, what about your first Bernstein moment?
I'm a West Side Story person, I'm afraid. I remember I got given a cassette. Oh, dear, what's that mean? I was given a cassette when I was probably about 10 years old, and it had Gershwin, Rhapsody in Blue, and An American in Paris, and the Symphonic Dancers from West Side Story, and they blew me away. That was my first introduction to Bernstein.
It's very interesting what you say, Edward, about your approach to him of just wanting to talk about him as a composer. That implies this might have been an issue, that he wanted to be taken more seriously as a composer than people did.
Oh, very much so. And there was a profound insecurity that his peers didn't take him seriously. Partly because he came from Broadway with those 5 Broadway shows, and partly because he wasn't writing in that cutting-edge avant-garde way. And I sensed that during the conversation that, he mentioned Quiet Place once or twice, and he said it's a tough piece, almost like a badge of honor. And there's no doubt that, although there are extraordinary things in the piece, that I do feel that he was trying perhaps a little too hard to write the music he felt he should be writing.
Do you agree with that, Sophie, that he wanted to create something avant-garde almost?
Well, I think it's certainly the later sort of post-70s, 80s Bernstein, we get a very different Bernstein, and there's a sort of weight, really, of what he's been doing before, I think, comes through, this slight sort of push away. But that's when he starts dabbling. He starts dabbling in atonal stuff. Copeland was doing it, obviously Stravinsky had done it, and he's looking at these and going, So you get a bit of that. You get that in Dybbuk in the ballet and things like that. And then I think that's kind of, there's a weight to what he's trying to do. And it's very conscious. And the early stuff that a lot of us really, kind of fell in love with, there's this extraordinary energy and sort of ease about it. And it became a lot harder, those after the New York Phil years, I think it just became harder. And he was sort of wrangling with it, I think.
You have to remember, I think, that he, when he took that sabbatical before he wrote Chichester Psalms, he wrote this wonderful poem about exploring all these avenues of music, including the stuff that you've talked about, Sophie, and came home to realize that he should be writing what he instinctively felt he could write.
There's a wonderful story about him in Indiana, actually, when he was composing Quiet Place in that weird sort of 6-week period. And he went to talk to the composition students at Indiana, listened to 4 of their pieces, and they were all very earnest, kind of serial pieces. And he said to them, "What do you people like to do just for fun? What's the music you actually want to write? Because it can't possibly be this." And a couple of them sat down and started improvising at the piano. He said, "No, that's more like it.
Yeah.
For goodness sake, go away and compose how you want to compose." It's fascinating that coming from him, because if ever there was someone who was super conscious of sometimes not composing necessarily what he wanted to compose, but, felt the need to be something more, I don't know, serious in inverted commas.
But having said that, he loved the gamesmanship of composition. And, all those literary allusions, there was always a literary inspirational catalyst.
The Kabbalah stuff for the Mass is absolutely amazing.
Incredible. And he loved words, I think, almost as much as he loved notes.
Tell us about, can someone speak about his librettist for A Quiet Place?
Stephen Wadsworth.
Yeah, tell us more about him. Curious, he doesn't have a Wikipedia entry.
Does he not?
No.
Good heavens.
Yeah.
I mean,
Friend of Jamie, right? That was the connection.
Yes, he came through an introduction from Bernstein's eldest daughter, Jamie. I don't know whether they were at Harvard together.
Yes, they were. Yeah. He wanted an interview,
very talented, brilliant wordsmith. Not something that's apparent on every page of A Quiet Place, if I'm absolutely honest. But
shame on you.
I know. I had to get it out there. But
disagree.
Somebody who genuinely had a brilliant gift for words, and what's more, shared Bernstein's obsession with complicated crosswords and acrostics and what have you. They'd sit down and do, the really impossible sort of listener cryptic crosswords and things which he had shipped over from England every week. And so he was a brilliant word man. And from what Bernstein's assistant at the time, a wonderful man called Charlie Harmon, has to say about Stephen Wadsworth, an intensely likeable man as well, which certainly wasn't true of all of that entourage, but he was very much more organised than the composer. So, for instance, he was, most of the way through Act 2 when Bernstein was still faffing around halfway through Act 1. So he was very much on top of the project. I think his efficiency is one of the reasons the thing got finished at all.
And it's interesting, Sophie, that love of wordplay, that, of course, as we just heard Henry singing, that device that's used to express his mental illness of the rhyming words, which becomes such a kind of key part of A Quiet Place as it develops. I mean, that makes perfect sense.
Yeah, absolutely. It's worth saying, he was incredibly young. So this is Bernstein at the end of his life, and Stephen Wadsworth, he was in his late 20s when he ends up on this project. So this is quite an extraordinary thing, and he talks about the sort of, how do you tell Bernstein, who by this time is this sort of colossus, I don't like that, or I don't think we should do it that way. There was it was quite a close collaboration in that way, actually.
Wasn't Stephen Wadsworth wasn't he one of the librettists that Lenny was considering for the piece he was planning to write before he died, the piece about survivors, which he was going to write in multiple languages about the 50 years since the Second World War. Alas, we never got to hear it. He had so many ideas, but it was a bit like Marlowe, who he was such a great conductor of.
I think there's another direct connection, Ollie, with Stephen Wadsworth, that I think his sister was killed in a car crash just before the opera was created. So that echo at the beginning of Act 2.
Yeah, well, Stephen is a very interesting guy, and we actually had some email exchanges in relation to this particular production. He was very generous with his thoughts. And it was interesting also to hear from another source how much of the material in A Quiet Place is not just related to Leonard Bernstein and his family, but Stephen Wadsworth and his. And yes, he had suffered a really horrific family bereavement. His sister had been killed, I think, in a car accident. And so much of that grief and pain is present in the piece. But also, in the same way that Leonard Bernstein wanted to present a character who was gay in his new opera, so Stephen Wadsworth wanted to present a character who was bisexual. And so it was quite an even exchange of ideas. And you're right to say, I mean, I think there's an interview on YouTube, you can see, it's 10 minutes, it's pretty good, between, Leonard Bernstein and Stephen Wadsworth are being interviewed about A Quiet Place. And it's clear that there was a real equal relationship, and that Stephen Wadsworth could say, actually, I don't think that works at all. And he had the kind of bravery and courage to do that. And I think that's at least partly responsible, along with the personal material they were both drawing on, for the charge in the piece and the way in which it's such a strong piece of theatre.
And I wondered if any of you think there's anything in the period of which it was written, this sort of sense, talking about A Quiet Place here, of the age of uncertainty, you know, the Cold War at its absolute height, the very fear of, real fear of nuclear annihilation, change in the White House in America, AIDS was just coming around the corner that was going to change so many things. It feels that in many ways this is a period piece of 40 years ago with very specific relations to what was happening at that time. Let's go Sophie first.
Okay. So I was just going to say both of them, though. I mean, that's the thing. So you have this... I'm interested on you on A Quiet Place, because to me, Trouble in Tahiti is this outward-looking societal commentary, you know, consumerism, you know, suburbia, the 1950s, this post-war, and it is about society. It's looking outwards. Whereas A Quiet Place is this psychological, you know, traumatic sort of thing, and it's very inward-looking. So I think there's an interesting thing of how the wider world plays out in both of these, because it comes into both of them, but fundamentally I see Tahiti going outwards on a comment on society, and it's so inward-looking, this sort of psychological drama, but, you know...
And that's why they should be done together, and I think that's brilliant.
But I think
you've done together.
You've got the perfect solution here, which is doing them together but separate.
Absolutely.
Because the trying to do Trouble... Originally, Trouble in Tahiti was in the middle of this opera, and it simply didn't work there. It was sat in completely the wrong place as a kind of flashback, which is a clever idea until you see it.
So it's not a very clever
but it works. It's not clever at all. No. But Trouble in Tahiti on its own is a fabulous a kind of, well, curtain raiser in a way. There's more to it than that. But I think Sophie's right that both of them sort of encapsulate these two different moments. And A Quiet Place feels very embittered in places.
Well, I was just going to say that I think the anger in it, of course, written after his wife's death, but what surprises me somewhat is the amount of anger in the piece. And although it has a hopeful resolution, because all Bernstein's pieces have hopeful, cathartic endings.
Well, the glimmer of hope, yeah. Yeah.
He was either a qualified optimist or a hopeful pessimist. But, you know, I think the two of them together, they're two sides of the same coin. And, but I always thought that the anger in A Quiet Place surprised me. All that dense vocal counterpoint, which is, you know, people clashing.
And I don't think we should forget that Leonard Bernstein was very politically engaged and was someone who was at some risk for his convictions in the early 1950s when he wrote Trouble in Tahiti. And it is satirical, and it is ultimately a political work, given the orthodoxies of the Eisenhower era. And in the same way, I think A Quiet Place takes issue or analyses the degree to which American society had in itself become embittered. And we're talking about the era after Nixon and after Vietnam, and the way in which the American dream had soured very evidently, and had then become mired in this stasis and cynicism of the Reagan era, I think is very much a critical part of the piece. I think that his political leanings are very evident in the opera, and again, part of its energy.
He refused to speak to Bush. He had as little to do with Reagan as he possibly could. And of course, he'd been a darling of the
Kennedys, yeah.
White House, and was always friends with Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis and the children. So I think that's a really important point. Politically, everything had gone extremely sour by the time of A Quiet Place. And that certainly comes through in the kind of darkness of it, not so much the anger, which I think is probably more motivated by personal.
Wasn't there something, I mean, during the Nixon era, when mass was in preparation, I mean, there were rumors going around that Nixon had spies in the rehearsals because
there's
people
documents
thought it
to
was
prove
a
it.
subversive piece.
He did. He sent people in to spy and to let him know if anything was. And of course, Bernstein had had his passport confiscated in the 50s, had been hauled in front of the Un-American Activities Committee. I mean,
which was still very recent. I mean,
it was,
comparatively.
And all of the. The Elia Kazans, the ones who'd come up with a sort of long list of names when asked to name names, had obligingly done so. We're all still around and still very successful.
So Sophie, for him, music really mattered. I mean, it wasn't just about entertaining people in concert halls or opera houses or people paying bucks for a Broadway ticket. It had a much bigger purpose.
Yeah, it always did. And I mean, this kind of, the sincerity of the hope, or, the end of mass, genuinely, when Bernstein does all of the, calls for peace and things like that, he really does mean it. It's very easy to look at it with a cynical eye, I think. But he really, really did sort of mean that stuff. And thinking about the political side, I mean, it was picketed, wasn't it? The first production of A Quiet Place was picketed because of the sexuality of the characters on stage.
Really?
So, I mean, you actually have this in Houston, I mean, it was... the content
protesting
was,
because the lead character was gay.
Yeah, absolutely. So it is sort of built into all of that. But yeah, certainly. I mean, it really mattered, and he really cared, and he really wanted to put this stuff in. It is always public. I mean, it's packed with autobiography. It's very hard to find a Bernstein piece that isn't. But it is underlined with all of exactly what Ollie was saying.
And it's the great thing about Leonard Bernstein is that yes, he does let it all hang out, and it is very, very sincere, and the emotion is personal. But in the context of late 20th century classical music, that's very much frowned upon, and the snobbery with which Leonard Bernstein was treated in relation to his music is still current to this day. I mean, even some of the reactions to A Quiet Place this time round, there is a kind of what was Leonard Bernstein's business trying to dabble in serious classical music? He should stick to Broadway. And I think that's interesting in terms of illustrating one of the disconnects between the music that the public enjoys and the sincerity and the melody and the directness and the theatrical directness that Bernstein offers, and what is regarded as, inverted commas, serious contemporary music.
I remember when I started listening to him as a conductor, as a young man, and reading the reviews that came out, and they some of them were very good reviews, but they always had that inference that they were great despite the fact of where he came from. And I talked about mass earlier. I mean, one of the things about mass is a celebration of music in all its guises and its ability to transcend all the things that divide us. I mean, that's really the theme of the piece. It's a protest piece as well, and very much of its time. But that celebration of, I mean, he dabbled in everything. And that's what I love so much about
and a lot of this comes up in the letters, Nigel. You edited his extraordinary collection of, I think, 10,000 plus that are held in the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. How much in those letters does he talk about the creation of these two operas? Could you give us a couple of
Actually, very little. The reason being that he wrote the libretto himself for Trouble in Tahiti. So really all he's doing is telling people like Copeland that it's going rather well, and actually Mark Blitzstein was another person he was very close to at the time, a fantastic kind of agit-prop music theatre composer. It's a slightly cheap way of describing him, but he was remarkable. And so the only communication about the kind of creative endeavour is with the people at Brandeis who were organising the first performance. And exactly as with...
Which was a bit of a mess, wasn't it?
It was a mess, but it was as nothing compared with the mess that they made of giving the premiere of A Quiet Place, through no fault of Bernstein's or Stephen Wadsworth's, but some very incompetent planning. but that was all happening on the spot. Bernstein was there.
So there weren't letters.
And when they were really working away at it, they were closeted in this apparently beautiful house in Indiana, working away for 6 or 7 weeks with what was supposed to be no interruptions, but what seemed to be more or less parties every night, didn't they? But anyway, the idea certainly bore some kind of fruit. They got most of the work done then. But there's very little about that in the correspondence. What keeps cropping up, though, both in the 50s and particularly in the early 80s, is always going back to this, why do I always have to be doing something? Why do I have to keep conducting a million concerts a month when I want just to compose? And when somebody would challenge him and say, well, just don't do them then. Oh, I can't do that.
Yeah.
I mean, what would my public think?
Yeah.
There's a real contradiction there, and it was one that was really significant in the 40s when he was particularly close to Copland. Copland said exactly this to him. He said, you're going to have to decide. Are you a composer? Are you a conductor? My vote, Copland more or less said privately, is you're a conductor who composes a bit. And one of the reasons Copland said that was because Bernstein was such a glorious conductor of Copland's music. None better, frankly. And Copland knew a good thing when he heard it. But this tension between the kind of public maestro and the private endeavour, the hard work of composing, was one that always troubled him, but particularly, I suppose, after the huge success of West Side Story, and then coming immediately on top of, the huge success of West Side Story, and this is the new music director of the New York Philharmonic. Right there, in the space of a couple of weeks, you have this extraordinary kind of clash of activities that I don't think anyone could have resolved.
Do you think, very quick question before you come in, do you think he expected people would read these letters? I mean, he was such a kind of man who lived his life in the public eye, was always on the television. Did he write them with an eye to posterity, do you think?
That's such a good question. On the whole, not the interesting ones. The interesting ones, the ones to his wife, Felicia, and especially the ones from her to him, which are really extraordinary. The ones to Copland, which are often quite intimate, and some of them only came to light just before my book came out as well. So, and the ones to people like Stephen Sondheim, I don't think those were meant for public consumption, even posterity public consumption, except that his faithful secretary, Helen Coates, who was, by all accounts, a kind of dragon in some ways, but she hoarded every bit of paper he had. So all of this stuff was filed.
Yeah.
So I guess at some stage he must have realised people were going to start looking at it, but I don't think the letters themselves were written for public consumption.
I want to read the letters that aren't in the book.
Yeah,
those are the ones I want to read.
Plenty of them.
Plenty of them.
Nigel had to leave out. I mean, Sophie, here we are talking about these two operas by Leonard Bernstein, and it's always seemed to me that one of the issues about him is that difficultness in characterising what his pieces are. Trouble in Tahiti ran on Broadway, I think, for 42 performances. That was when it really, first of all, came to attention as part of a Broadway double bill with a dance work, I think. Candide has been in and out of the Opera House and the Musical Theatre stage. Plenty of opera companies have staged West Side Story. I mean, he's quite difficult to put in a box, isn't he?
Yeah, and I think this is the thing for him that he found so difficult, of how to navigate all of these different activities. But in terms of thinking of the works, I mean, actually how each one is written sort of tells you what it is. There's a hell of a difference between writing a Broadway show and writing Trouble in Tahiti, where you're writing your own libretto, you're doing your own orchestrations. There's a different process, and I think he was sort of very aware of that. It's worth noting that and particularly with American opera in the 50s, you get tons of it on Broadway. You mentioned Mark Blitzstein, who's super important because Trouble in Tahiti is dedicated to Blitzstein. You know, Bernstein named his 2 younger children after characters in Blitzstein. I mean, Blitzstein's hugely important for him as a sort of model of a sort of music for theatre writer. And, you know, you get these, but his operas are being done on Broadway, you know. You're getting Menotti operas on Broadway. So the distinction,
also tons on TV.
Yes.
I mean, Trouble in Tahiti was, I think, seen on television very early on, done in the...
So the distinction is not as clear as we want to put it all in a box. I think it's always wanting to put it in a box. Yes, on the front it says Candide's an operetta. Yes, it says on that. And it is. But, you know, it's a lot of us trying to put it.
But that was the problem later in his life, is that he was surrounded by people telling him, Lenny, you've written this great opera in West Side Story. Let's do it with opera singers. Candide. The last performances he did around the time I did the interview, I mean, you know, the whole point of the piece is that it's a parody, it's a spoof, it's full of wonderful satire. And why would you get June Anderson, you know, a dramatic coloratura soprano, and Christa Ludwig and all these mates of his who were quite wrong for the spirit of the piece, but he wanted to somehow elevate the piece into, you know, to be regarded more seriously, and that was the problem.
It's sort of his anxiety.
We're almost out of time. Just I want from each of you a last very brief thought on the significance of this double bill being back on stage at this point, and what it means. Edward first.
Well, as I say, I think they belong together, and I've never bought the version that incorporated Trouble in Tahiti. Makes no sense. These are 2 sides of the same coin. I want Ollie Mears to do Mass here. Because even though it's of its time, I think it's an extraordinary piece.
Yeah.
So
good. Well, that's that thought lodged.
Yeah.
We could ask our audience here to vote on it, but I think we better leave that decision to Oliver.
A Quiet Place is very interesting in terms of what happened to it after its premiere, and then he revised it, and then it kind of vanished a bit like Mass. And the fact that it's now, pretty much since the sort of mid-teens, the centenary, it says a lot that it's on this stage, you know, and it says a lot that it's now being, you know, reassessed. And I think that says a lot about a lot of Bernstein's legacy. The 28th centenary was a big deal for that in terms of these later works. Yeah. You know, Mass really kind of vanished. Now is seen as quite this huge piece. And 5 recordings now. So it's this big push, you see. It's part of this big reassessment, I think. And it's important it's here.
Reassessment with a sort of clean slate, if you like. Nigel.
I think what I'd say is that there is no more personal piece, really, than either of these operas, but particularly A Quiet Place. What makes it moving is that really intense personal investment from the 2 of them creating a way in Indiana in the spring of 1981 or 82. It's hard to imagine another opera, actually, that has quite such a personal investment of really quite private, intimate things from their own lives worked into a drama in that way. And that does make it something really special and unlike almost any other opera I can think of, actually. That's the thing that makes it remarkable, and particularly when you hear it in tandem with the kind of Bernstein that was around 30 years earlier.
And as you said, Oliver, right back at the beginning of the evening, this has been a project very long in the making. You must be delighted with both the response to it and the fact that it has provoked all these discussions.
No, I am delighted. I mean, I'm obviously biased because I programmed the pieces and I directed them too. But the more that we've worked on them, the more richness and complexity and interest and musical value we found in them. And the more we realised that, particularly A Quiet Place, was well ahead of its time. And as Nigel says, there is nothing quite like A Quiet Place. It is a work of really staggering originality in the context of classical music from the last 50 years. And if we've achieved nothing else, I hope that it has inspired people to think again about both pieces.
Edward Sexton, Sophie Redfern, Nigel Simeoni, Oliver Mears, thank you very much indeed. We clearly could have talked on and on for much longer about, so much to say, isn't there, about these 2 operas, A Quiet Place and Trouble in Tahiti. They run here at the Limbury Theatre on this stage through until the 24th of October. There's a relaxed performance on the 22nd of October. You can buy your tickets online by going to the Royal Ballet and Opera website, although I think it's pretty much returns only at this point, but well worth trying to get one of those. Thank you to our audience here in the bustling heart of London. And thank you to our audience joining us. I know many people tuning in America tonight, as well as around the world on our live stream. Our insights are supported by Rolex. Thank you for joining us. And from the Royal Opera House, Covent Garden, good night.